Shalom and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bread, where we discuss the weekly Torah portion. This week's Parashat is Parashat Pinchas. It's the 8th Parashat of the book of Bamidbar, also called Numbers, and it's called Pinchas, which means mouth of copper. In this week's Parashat, we are looking at basically what's happened is Zimri and Cosby were slain. The Israeli and the Midianite woman, and what had happened is the Midianite had come and joined with Yisrael, their women, and ended up causing them to go worship their god. And so a plague had struck them, and Zimri and Cosby, an Israeli man, brought a Midianite woman right by the tabernacle while people were weeping. And so Pinchas went in and slew both of them, and the plague was stayed, and the covenant of peace was made with him. And then you have the numbering. They were told to go smite Midian, go to war with them. They were numbered for war, and then the land was divided up. And we also have the daughters of Zelohad, whose father didn't have a son. And they asked if they could take the inheritance, and Yodewahid said yes, and also gave the laws of inheritance. And then you have the all the daily offerings given and the special offerings for the holy days given. And then the half Torah, you have Eliyahu fleeing from Isabel and going and talking to Elisha. So anyway, that's the Parashat in a nutshell. And my message this year is called "To Everyone a Reward." And for 2010-11. I'll start off with a verse in Obadiah 1:15. It says, "For the day of Yodewahid is near upon all nations. As you have done, it shall be done unto you. Your reward shall return upon your own head." And basically, we start off with this parashat really talking about this concept of the rewards coming and the consequences for your actions. And what we have right now is a time where, much like the time for the Midianite and Israel, there was a time they were running around sleeping with these Midianite women, and it was sin, and they were worshiping their god. And they're all doing this while they are the children of Israel, somewhat in kind of the presence of Yodewahid. And this sin that people were doing before, all of a sudden when we see Cosby and Zimri come by and they're speared through the stomach, you see that enough is enough, and the time of judgment has come, and the days of basically having unpunished sin are over. Now this is a different story. And this is the first pattern that we pick up in this week's Torah portion, and we see that this is happening right now as people are doing pretty much what they want. People are interpreting the scriptures the way they want. They're saying God is this, God is that, all these denominations. Well, God isn't around telling people, no, that's not what I said, and this and that. So people are just getting away with whatever they want right now. But there's going to be a time when that is going to cease. And, there'll be a new sheriff in town, and everything's going to change. And this is what happened with Pinchas, and he received the covenant of peace. And that peace is a peace between God and man. And really that peace between God and man happens when there's obedience to the Torah, or obedience to the Torah is restored, when punishment for the wicked is restored, which is part of that, which keeps the the kingdom clean. A lot of people think that there's going to be no punishment for them, that, Jesus saved them, or Yeshua or Yahushua, depending what you say. Some people just don't think that there's going to be any real judgment. And what we see is judgment started with Yisrael and his house first, and then afterwards they were to declare war on Midian. And now judgment started with Yisrael and the plague, and all the way down into the micro universe where it affected Zimri and Cosby. And then it worked all the way out. The plague was a bigger picture of Israel being judged. And then outside of that judgment comes to Midian when Yodewahid says that they are supposed to go vex them and smite them. And so all the children Israel are numbered for war. So what you see is this pattern of judgment, which covers everything from the individual, Israel, and the nations aside that have done harm. And judgment is going to flow for everybody. And a lot of theologies and a lot of religious groups out there want to teach that somehow their group doesn't get judged. Their group is whisked away or set aside or this and that. But if we look in the Torah, that's just not how it was. It's always been the pattern that Yodewaheh judges his house first, and then the judgment will come to the others. There's this concept to everyone a reward. That includes the righteous will receive a reward, and the wicked will receive a reward for their actions. And anybody who thinks that they're going to be bypassed from any rewards, I think they're being foolish. I think that we get to the next section, which is the responsibility and reward, where the children of Israel are numbered for war. And this is part of your responsibility as a Yisraeli. When you follow the Elohim of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, number one, you're going to have enemies. And your following of Yodewaheh is really expressed through the obedience to his Torah or his will. Torah represents his will, his word, and your obedience to that is what makes you part of Israel. And your disobedience to it, even if you are a ethnic Israeli, it's actually going to be worse for you if you're part of Israel and you're disobeying. Judgment will come to you. And so it's not enough to say, oh, well, I'm one of God's chosen people. Well, that isn't going to help you in the day of judgment, because the reality is, if you're one of God's chosen people, you especially should be obeying him and keeping his words. And so we see that this concept of the responsibility and the reward being tied in this parashat to the numbering to go to war. This is your responsibility as an Israeli, that when people are fighting ultimately against Yodewaheh and his Torah, his will, because his people are defined by their obedience to his will. So it all comes back to his will, which is embodied in the Torah, which is really a reflection of who Yodewaheh is, what his traits are, his values. And if you hold those same values, then people will come to war against you. If you don't hold those values, whether you're a nation of heathens or whether you're one of the children of Israel and you rebel against his will, then he will come against you. So you're going to either be fighting the people who are coming against Yodewaheh because you are staying in alignment to his will, or you are going to be at war with Yodewaheh when he comes against you for not being in alignment with his will. But it doesn't change. The pattern doesn't change. And so the question is, whose side are you going to be on? This is the responsibility for those who obey Yodewaheh. And the land, then, is the spoil, is its reward. We see that they're numbered for war, and then the allotment for land is also given right next to each other. And so we have responsibility and reward. The land being the reward, the promised land. And one of the responsibilities is to go to war for Israel and fight the enemies of Elohim. One of the interesting things here is that the land also represents the flesh, and the flesh that is obedient to Torah. So in this sense, the promised land is a model of Mashiach. It was the flesh, a living man who kept the Torah perfectly. This was the promised land, that if you followed the Torah, this is what your flesh would look like. This is the real promise. And since it essentially reflects Yodewaheh's character, this reminds me of the Levi'im and the priests, where it says to them, it says, I am your inheritance. So Yodewaheh himself is our inheritance. And you say, well, what's that mean? I believe that means that his Torah, who they are as they live out the Torah, in itself is its great reward and is their inheritance. And it's through his word which they get the best of the land, the best of the tithes, and all the portion that's given to them. So we follow this back and we see that he is the word. This word represents him, and that those people who follow his word, that his word lives out in their flesh, that itself is their inheritance. And this takes us to this concept of honoring your father. the daughters of Zelohad didn't have an inheritance. He had no sons, and so they asked Moshe if the inheritance of their father was just going to be taken away. And Moshe talked to Yodewaheh, and he said, no, daughters of Zelohad are correct. The inheritance of their father will pass to them. Now, again, we see this pattern all through the Torah over and over again, that it's almost like the pattern of Isaiah 56. They weren't sons. Normally the daughters are married off to somebody else, and they would be joined to that man, and that man would then give them part of the inheritance. But there's an interesting thing in the Torah where the blessings and the cursings stay with the family a lot of times. They impact the family. Doesn't mean you can't break out of those. You can actually break out of away from your blessing for being as Israeli or child of Abraham or whatever it is. You can certainly break away from the blessings of your family. But there's some inherent blessings, they kind of stick with families. The same goes for cursings. There's cursings that flow along with families, so that I think we can see this pattern just by your parents. As a child, you can't determine who your parents are. That's the environment you grow up in. And it's going to be a blessing or a cursing. If you had a father like Abraham, who it says God knew that he would diligently teach his children to obey his commandments, well, then that was a blessing. If you grew up, among other nations or among the wicked, then that also would be a cursing that you'd have to deal with. It doesn't condemn you in the sense that you can't break away from it and do what's right, but it certainly impacts you. So in that sense, it is a blessing and a cursing. And those really, like an inheritance, they move with the family. And so we see this picture of the daughters of Zelohad, and that blessing of their father stayed with them. He didn't have a son, because they were willing to honor their father. They were part of their father. And so it was a portion of blessing that they received, even though they weren't sons. And that's a strong pattern in the scriptures. Isaiah 56 says, anyone who takes hold of his Sabbath, the stranger, who takes hold of his Sabbath and takes hold of his covenant, doesn't pollute the Sabbath, does things that please him, will get a name better than sons and daughters. So you see that it all comes down to this concept of obedience to the Father's will. It doesn't matter if you're a stranger or a son, everybody is evaluated by the same measure. You may have to work harder if you were a stranger, and you may have blessings if you were a son. But if you reject those and still don't obey, then what good were those blessings? You've cast them away. So this takes us to the next portion of this week's Parashat, which is the offerings for the holy days. And when you look at what the pattern is and what it really is it's a set of responsibilities and requirements at specific times. So you're going to be measured on the day of Sukkot, because you were told to have this offering on day 1 and this offering on day 2. What it's saying is, throughout your journey, there's going to be times when you are going to be measured, and that time is going to require certain things for you to have done. And we see this all the way at the back of this parasha at the beginning, where you see Caleb and Yahushua. It's reminded us that they are going to go in out of everybody else who had rebelled. They had died in the wilderness, and only Caleb and Yahushua were still around. And it was for actions they did a long time ago. There was a day of visitation, a time of visitation, when they gave the reports that they made a choice. And their choice was to say that we could obey Yodewaheh and go in and do this, while everybody else was disobeying. That choice then carried over and has impacts now that they're going to be able to go into the promised land. And it's the same way that Cosby and Zimri's choice, even though they got away with sin, no punishment, there came a day when that got called, and that got taken account of, and that's what happened. And the judgment came upon them, and they were put to death. So this whole concept of what belonged to the daughters of Zelohad, and how after his death it passed on to his the judgment it passed on to his daughters, and it wasn't taken away from him. In the same way, that blessing wasn't taken away from Caleb and Yahushua later, because they obeyed in the previous time. And this is what it all comes down to. What are the expectations? We're always making choices. These choices lead us to the final end part of this parashat, when the Haftorah, where Isabel wants to come against Eliyahu, because he is representing the word of Yodewaheh. And you're going to have war when you do that. You simply are going to choose a side, You're either going to obey, it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, you're going to choose to obey Yahweh and honor Him, or you're not. And those people who desire to obey, war will come against them. There will be hardship that comes against them, just like Caleb and Yahushua, all the people wanted to stone him. But when you make those choices and you stick with them, you will be rewarded. To everyone will be the reward, good or evil, eventually. So we need to think about our choices and how our choices affect, as we learned with the inheritance, generations down the road. Are we passing on a blessing or a cursing? Our obedience, like the obedience of Pinchas in one moment, is going to give him a covenant of peace forever in his generation. So, well, that goes to show you that what we do, whether it be righteousness or wickedness, it impacts the next generation, it impacts the bloodline. And it will continue to bear fruit, whether good or bad, reward or punishment, generations to come. So I say, we must ponder the paths of our feet, let all of our ways be established, as it says in the Scriptures. Till next time, I will say, continue to grow in righteousness, and Shalom.